Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
But what have you got? Matt gazed greedily into his brother's hand. Nick was weaker in the counting, and so was still moving his lips, going over the coins. 33. Finally, he answered cheerfully. I got 52, Matt said. That adds up to 85. That's enough, Nick asked hopefully. I don't know, the older man shrugged. But when we were walking by yesterday, I looked at the window, and it said that in honor of the holiday discounts on bouquets. Nick, who always marveled at his brother's ingenuity, said excitedly. Outside the window of a small apartment in an old 5-story building, the sun was shining and there was not a cloud in the sky. Such wonderful weather stood for a day, which coupled with the abnormally high air temperature for March, led to the fact that as the time moved towards International Women's Day, there was almost no snow left on the streets of the city, and the vegetation even began to swell, greenish, and buds. The weather. Nick and Matt sat in their room and counted the contents of their empty piggy banks. It was customary for their little family's piggy banks to be filled once a week after Mom came home before the weekend and usually had a little change from what she had left over after going into the store. Natalie just thought that pocket money was important for kids because it taught them the value of money. And besides, you can keep them busy with difficult choices. What should I spend it on? To buy gum today or tomorrow when they go for a walk in the park on Sunday, to eat ice cream or a hot donut with jelly. Now Matt and Nick were 8 and 7 years old, respectively, with first grade looming for the fall. As for the piggy banks, which were one for each brother, their current contents had accumulated for 3 whole months, because the small family was quite tight with money. And it was because Natalia had been fired from the bookstore where she had worked for a long time, and now she had to find a new job, of course, because the savings were melting away. So you have 2 children. As soon as at the interview, for example, in the supermarket for the vacancy cashier sounded this phrase, with slight variations, but one meaning always Natalie tensed, because it meant one thing in communication with a specialist from the Human Resources Department. She now walks on the edge. Because no one liked the fact that the potential employee had difficult family circumstances, that the potential employee would take a sick leave and 1,000 other reasons to go away. After all, Natalie, in principle not accustomed to lying, honestly said that yes, she has no husband and no relatives do not help to raise children. They live on their own with their small family. So it turned out that the current situation of Natalie, Nick, and Matt as if hinted that soon someone would be completely poor. But Natalie tried to hold on and not descend into despair, but it wasn't easy. After all, she had to pay off debts on utility bills, and her brothers had a pneumonia in winter, and the doctor prescribed a long course of expensive vitamins. And they grew up. Naturally, like all kids, so they had to buy new clothes for spring. The family was orphaned, left without the main breadwinner defender, and most importantly without a dear loved one. A little over a year ago, he was just going to work in the morning and stopped at an intersection to wait for a green light. And there was some rich kid coming back from a club at 7 o'clock in the morning. He was, as they found out later, drunk and taken some nasty stuff at the club, and on the corner he lost control. The car flew into a bus stop. Everyone managed to bounce out of the way except Chris. The major, he died on the spot too. His family, by the way, didn't even bother to offer moral compensation. They were generally dismissive of other people's grief. We'll have to think of something. Matt sighed. Mom's so sad. We have to make her happy. He waved his hands. How about we sell something? Nick asked. No, we need everything ourselves, but I'll think of something. Matt said stubbornly. There was a rustling in the hallway. That's Mom walking in there. Let's clean it up, Matt told his brother, and they began to put the coins back in the cracks. On the backs of the porcelain sninkies, the piggy banks were modern. No need to break to get to the contents. There's a plastic flap at the bottom. You're not dressed yet? Asked her mother, peering into the room. We need help. We quickly scooped up Matt. No, we don't. What are we, little? Natalie, nodding, shut the door back. But stop it, Matt told his brother, because Nick's lips quivered. He always cringed somehow when Mom dressed in all black, and tied a black shawl on her head. That's how she looked at the funeral of her husband and the father of her children. That's how she looked every time they went to the cemetery once a month. It took a long time to get to that eternal last refuge. On 2 buses, streetcars, and shuttles across town. And no matter how little money there was in the family, Natalie always found a couple hundred for fresh flowers. She took great care to keep everything nice and clean and neat. We were the only ones left, Natalie said quietly and stroked her youngest son's head. We are orphans. She always said something sad on the road. Nick roared at first. Then he got used to it and just sniffled tensely. Matt looked at his brother in a pathetic and patronizing way. He took him firmly by the paw when they got off at the last stop. In general, Matt began to think a lot about life for an 8-year-old. As he got off, thoughts came. He, figuratively speaking, looked at them from all sides, evaluated them, and figured out how they could be applied to real life or they would remain purely in his head. And lately, Matt had been particularly concerned with the future of his family. He wondered more and more if his mom would get married, because he knew it happens. And even some adults say it's necessary to have a man in the house, an example for the sons of a master. True, Matt did not share such views. Why do they need a hypothetical man in the house, especially if he looks like Uncle Tom, a former colleague of Dad who works in the same car service? He's been dropping by more and more lately. Sometimes he'd stay for lunch or dinner and compliment Natalie on what a great cook she was. A couple of times he brought his brother's toys, plastic cars, which are cheaper than a loaf of bread you can buy at roadside stands. Do you miss your father? Uncle Tom liked to ask. Matt would hit him for it, because Nick would start crying. But Uncle Tom, it was like he was happy to see a child cry, and he'd get on his nerves and tell him a man shouldn't cry. They obviously lacked a serious upbringing. And so, apart from Uncle Tom, there were almost no guests in their house. Those grandparents who were mom and dad to Natalie were known to the brothers only from photos, died of a stroke one after another before they were born. And those grandparents who were mom and dad to Chris were alive, but didn't want to know their grandchildren because they were against the marriage from the beginning. Nick was lucky enough not to be foolishly naive about it. But Matt, from a casual conversation, realized that these people think badly of their mother. They think that their daddy is not their own, that Natalie turned them on somewhere on the side she walked. Matt was sick of hearing that, so he didn't need those grandparents. And he hadn't witnessed the scene when those people called, by the way. Natalie, after Chris died, and offered to do a genetic test for parentage. They made it a condition. They said that then they would help to raise the children financially. Natalie, insulted, refused to do so, and all contacts with relatives were cut off. When they visited the cemetery, the first few times Nick sobbed with his mother, but not just because he missed his dad very much too. He was scared. Matt wished he'd had time to hit that aunt. It was some distant relative who had scared his little brother at the funeral, saying that there were dead people everywhere sleeping. But if little kids mess around here, they'll come up, grab them and drag them underground with them. Mom, of course, calm me down. Nika said it never happens. But for how long were logical explanations enough for the nun, even though they were yearlings? Matt considered himself not just the older, but a much more seriously intelligent man, and generally treated his brother patronizingly. Now he and Nick were standing quietly, and Mom was crying, sobbing bitterly, and asking someone unseen. Why was she being treated like this? What had she done to deserve such grief? I'm hungry, Nick reported. Matt sighed. They weren't starving, but lately they had mostly potatoes, pasta, and bread on the table, and sometimes a little fruit in season. Mom also bought soups and chicken kits and canned goods. Then, of course, we ate at daycare. But Nick, who was a terrible delicacy, constantly complained about hunger. But it's good that only to him, to his brother. And he didn't pester his mother. How could she bear it, poor thing? The brothers did not notice how a man suddenly approached them. In general, the cemetery was not very crowded that day. And here, as if from under the ground, this old woman, also all in black, grew up. She was so small and puny that she seemed to be carried away by the wind. She came up to them and stopped beside them. Natalie continued to sob. The brothers looked at their grandmother in bewilderment. Chris's wife, then, she said, wishing with her lips. Excuse me, who are you? Natalie, finally noticing her, turned around, wiping her tears. I say, you, Chris's widow? Yes, nodded the woman. And you are? Margaret, I'm his teacher. Natalie frowned. It was natural that there had been teachers in her husband's life, but she hadn't personally heard of any Margaret and couldn't recall the old woman at the funeral. You go to him too, yes, said Natalie, implying that the old woman had apparently come to this sad place for the same reason she had. No, I go to my husband's, answered the grandmother, and I visit him. He was a good Chris, smart. I remember, first in my class. What did you teach? Geography and summer camp. Natalie gasped. She suddenly realized who she was looking at. Of course, her husband had told this story many times when he was 12 years old, when he went to summer camp and got lost in the woods and was severely stung by bees. And Margaret, for the summer moonlighting educator, not only competently rendered first aid, but while lying Chris in the infirmary, visited him every day cared for. His own parents did not come to the boy, referring to the great business, but as Chris told me, he suspected that they didn't really care. It wasn't like their son was left with an invalid, so there was no need to travel. Anyway, Chris remembered Margaret with great warmth, but as I recall now, Natalie, he had not seen her once since he returned from the camp. She had quit school and gone somewhere else. They barely kept in touch. And now, after all these years, she found him in real life, and it turns out she was too late. Nor did she see her former student while he was alive. In that case, the whole story was turning out to be very bitter. And so Natalie stood there at a loss as to what to say and how to say it. Here she should deal with her own thoughts and feelings, as they say, and not listen to another person. But I didn't want to be callous, indifferent, without feelings. Chris is gone, Margaret said. Gone, son. Natalie sighed. It became even heavier that here was an elderly man talking before her eyes. After all, Margaret calling Chris her son was absurd. He had a completely different mother. For a while, the two adults and the two children just stood silently by the bed, looking at the monument. In the distance, some birds were still hovering. The sun was shining clearly. You are poor? Asked the old woman and looked closely. No, we are fine, replied Natalie. She suddenly held out a fist to the old woman. I'm sorry. Natalie even stepped back. Not at all. Take it while it lasts. Granny was quick. She grabbed Natalie's hand and put something in her palm. Her fingers clenched in a bunch, and she bounced off to the side, and without saying goodbye, almost ran through the cemetery, somewhere in the direction of the gate. Mom, what did she want? Nick pulled Natalie's skirt. I don't know, the widow muttered confusedly. And then she carefully dropped her hand, as if she feared that the strange old woman might have left something evil there. On her hand lay a silver pendant in the shape of the constellation of the Great Bear. Fine lacework stars connected by thin chains were studded with transparent stones, drops of cassock. It was a luxurious yet elegant beauty. Mom, what is it? Matt asked. A piece of jewelry, Nick answered. Mom, why did the old lady give it to you? I don't know, said Natalie confusedly. Once more he looked around, but the strange Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Let's go, she said. She looked sadly at the monument on her husband's grave, and then, taking the children by the hands, she left the cemetery. When the family returned home, they were waiting for the usual hassle of preparing dinner, then still the laundry to unload, and also had to sort through the fall leaves that the boys had collected in the square near the house. They wanted to make a herbarium. And although Natalie was not to herbarium, she was in a heavy dusty apathy for the last few days, but she could not refuse her sons. In the evening, when the boys had gone to bed, Natalie remembered the old woman and the pendant. She had the impression that the grandmother might not have her head on straight. Why would she give her former student's wife such a thing? Well, the morning is wiser, Natalie decided, and put the thing on the shelf of the secretary behind the model sailboat. Chris assembled it and the kids helped. Finally went to bed. Ordinarily, Natalie slept without words. I mean, in principle, something appeared to her in the night. But they were chaotic and confusing passages that had something to do with reality. For example, she could recalculate the change in the store in her sleep because it seems that they counted the purchases incorrectly. Or she could take an interminably long time to climb the stairs because the elevator broke and wonder where her floor was. But on this night, Natalie dreamed something extraordinary. She was standing in the middle of an extreme snowfield. In the blue sky scattered myriads of stars, danced multicolored flashes, northern lights. And although Natalie was dressed in a pink summer sundress and was barefoot, she was not cold. She felt so good in her dream that the northern lights were singing, as if they were the sound of magical violins and flutes, whose melody penetrated her heart, sheltering her from all the worries of the world. In her dream, she distantly remembered that somewhere out there beyond the snowy, boundless desert, she still had children, but she suddenly became indifferent to it, that they were blind kittens, who could not grow up without their mother, would live alone, and she was fine here. So good that she would probably stay here forever. Don't. Suddenly, a soft, velvety voice sounded behind her. Natalie turned around and gasped in amazement. Standing in front of her was a polar bear, a huge furry one with stray eyes. Don't, he repeated and shifted out of the plush, stepping closer to her. You have to be alive and you can't stay here. Something in Natalie's heart snapped, and she felt a searing pain, but it wasn't bodily, it was her soul, the sorrow of losing her husband, the fear that she wouldn't be able to take care of her children. She felt sick, and she knew who was to blame. Suddenly, she held a trident like the one used to represent Poseidon, the god of the seas. Natalie shook it tightly and pointed the point at the bear. Stay back, she exclaimed. Is this all your fault? No, replied Mishka and fearlessly stepped closer. It's the weather, and it's up to you to decide what to do next. Natalie frowned. What was he talking about? And then she realized. Indeed, the weather had turned bad. Now she felt the cold, and the northern lights were gone from the sky, and the stars were out, and all around her a blizzard was blowing long, and every tiny particle of snow cut painfully like glass. Tears flowed from Natalie's eyes and immediately began to freeze into ice on her face. Leave me alone, she shouted to the bear and swung her trident at him. He stepped forward, she wounded him, but he seemed to have to go back anyway, as if he were a disobedient child. He exhorted her. You can't stay here. Natalie shook her head desperately. No, she couldn't go back. There she would be overwhelmed again with worries, responsibilities, fears, pain, loss, fatigue. And here she would simply lie down and sleep, and let the snowstorm sing her lullaby forever. No, I'm not leaving, said, as if the bear had read her thoughts, and stepped closer again. The trident fell out of Natalie's hands, and she weakly began to fall backwards, but did not fall. She was picked up by huge, soft paws. Warm, fluffy fur covered her with a blanket, and then Natalie woke up, jumped up sitting up on the bed and lingered. Where's what? Ah, she's home. It was just a dream. One can only dream such nonsense, sighed the woman. After breakfast, at which, naturally, the sons were again capricious, about the fact that the omelet is slippery and porridge with points, Natalie took them to the kindergarten. There, it was not without exchanging a few phrases with other moms and even one dad. In general, with all the people who brought the kids here. And although it was only March, they were only talking about the upcoming summer when they had to take the kids out of town, and about the upcoming September. It was the first school year for many of the kids in Matt and Nick's group. Coming out of kindergarten, Natalie was completely sad. Her crumbs no summer vacation, neither on the sea, not in the camp, nor in the village, also does not shine, and that until September 1, it generally frightened her. It was necessary to buy textbooks, stationery, new clothes, and it all promised to come out in so much money. And also, probably the school would start to collect money for teachers' holidays and excursions. Natalie was already thinking straight, how she and her little ones would be treated, considering they'd probably be the poorest in the class, maybe in the whole school. And of course, there was nothing to think about hiring her sons a tutor to help them prepare for first grade. Nothing. Natalie tried to cheer herself up. It used to be to school through the forest with wolves and one teacher for the whole village. And nothing. They grew up educated people. Further on in the schedule of the day, there were 2 interviews. At the first, Natalie barely voiced that she was a single mother. She was immediately told she wasn't hired. But I put that on my resume, she protested. You're wasting my time. Elsewhere, it was like everything was fine, and Natalie even allowed herself a little hope. Fell down on some stupid test about zodiac signs, teacups, and pencils. Walking outside, she almost cried. Why can't a person just get a job normally? After all, she is neat, not confrontational, without bad habits, and even knows French. Really, what does the latter matter to a salesman? Still, it was very frustrating. The mood was somewhere below the level of the Mariana Trench, and even the sun was not happy. Natalie wandered slowly down the street. What to make for dinner? Cutlets, there was still ground meat left in the freezer. The main thing to add more bread, and can still scroll vegetables. Apparently, only secretly can make her boys eat broccoli, beans, cauliflower, and all other healthy. Walking down the street, Natalie passed a jewelry store. There were a couple of saleswomen standing on the porch of this boutique, and a snippet of their conversation reached Natalie. Of course, he had his own progressive views, but this new interview format kicked out mockingly. One of them. And don't tell me, the other one supported her. Can you imagine? I was told already that I may not even try. Because, you see, not enough arrow foo. What stupid words. Anyway, he'll be looking for a sales girl for a long time. Yes, the first one laughed. Then he'll look for some professor's grandmother. Natalie slowed down a little. The jewelry store needs a salesman. She's a fool, though. She heard what they were saying. Apparently, the owner of this jewelry boutique is very serious about choosing candidates, and he certainly doesn't want a single mom. So enough of this nonsense. There's another place to try and get in. Roadside stands for candy bars and such. They needed a salesman, but they've already scared me in advance that the schedule is variable and there may be night shifts. Natalie was crossing the road when she was thinking, and although she was usually a very attentive pedestrian, now she didn't notice how she ran the red light. "Woman, where are you standing?" She was belatedly called out by one of the people standing near the traffic light. There was a shrill squeal of brakes. Everything was decided in a matter of moments and centimeters. The hood of a red sports car literally jabbed into Natalie's legs, causing her to stagger and swing her arms ridiculously. Then she leaned on it to keep her balance, breathing heavily. The driver's door slammed shut. "You're crazy," raged a young, blonde-haired man in a dark business suit. "What the hell are you doing?" "What am I doing?" Natalie, who was having a hard time thinking straight, said absent-mindedly, "I'm sorry." She whispered and swayed and stepped aside. Her head was buzzing. Dark flickers flashed before her eyes. A car hit, her husband hit by a car. It had all been about the same. And now she was almost being victimized. Yes, it suddenly began to dawn on Natalie that if it hadn't been an accident, her children might have been orphans by now. Chris had died because another man had broken the rules of the road, and now she was out on the roadway by herself. The situations are similar and yet opposite. At this point, Natalie's nerves gave out and she burst into loud tears. She cried ugly, choking on her tears, barely catching air. She was barely aware of what was going on around her, just reached the sidewalk and stood leaning against a pole. She almost hung on it, wrapping her arms around it. The driver of the red car quietly got behind the wheel and quickly drove smoothly to the curb, slowed down and got out again. He approached Natalie. "Woman, are you feeling ill?" "Of course I'm sick," some lady in a beard answered him. "You hit her." "Why would you lie?" A man with a check bag on wheels stepped in. "No, I didn't. She ran the red light herself and wasn't hurt at all. She was just scared." Natalie, meanwhile, continued to flounder in her hysterics and couldn't stop. She could hear the stranger asking her what was wrong through a layer of absorbent cotton. She could hear him telling her to sit down. And then she went with him like a wind-up doll when he put his arm around her shoulders and led her to a place where she could actually sit down. There was a cafe a stone's throw away. A bus pulled up, with people waiting at the stop. A woman in a beret, a man with a bag, and other witnesses of the incident began to climb into it. And beautifully said a middle-aged woman in a green coat, as in the TV series They Met by Chance, and he is a millionaire in a red car. Then the bus moved off, and everyone who witnessed this scene very quickly and forgot, because, in fact, nothing tragic happened, and everyone had their own lives and concerns. "I'm sorry," Natalie muttered. She was sitting at the cafe table. She had already drunk a glass of water brought by the waitress, a girl, and now she was warming her cold hands and her lats. "I don't know what came over me." "Stop apologizing," said the blonde man sitting across from me. "It's not your fault, is it? It's just that everyone reacts differently to stress." "My husband died the same way," Natalie said, suddenly, and bit his lip. She wasn't used to complaining to strangers and didn't like it. But here the words seemed to come by themselves. She said a few more words, apologized again, and looked away from the coffee in just those few moments. As she looked out the window, the coffee house was enough for the man's face to change. It was like a shadow ran across it, but he immediately pulled himself together and looked calm and collected again, generally giving away nothing of his reaction to her words. Natalie assured him that she didn't need to go to the hospital because she'd only have a bruise on her knee. "Oh, I'm late," she exclaimed and fussed. "I have a job interview." "Can I let you down?" he asked. "No, don't worry," waved Natalie away and fumbled embarrassedly in her purse. Still had to pay for his cup of coffee. "I'm paying decisively," he said, and before she would have collected the bills with change, attached the card dress of a new color to the True Waitress terminal. "This way I can let you down, at least somehow compensate for my fault. I should have been more careful on the road after all." Natalie hesitated. Should she take the job or not? She really wanted the job. The money was almost zero, so she nodded. It was a short drive of about 5 minutes, so she had time. The stranger introduced himself as Alex. She said her name, a few easy phrases. Natalie said she was looking for a sales job now, and she had a degree in economics. "Why not in the office then, or as a store manager?" Alex asked. "Yes, it just so happened," shrugged his shoulders. "I was already pregnant in my last year of study and decided that when I got out of maternity leave, I would look for a good place." And then Natalie told me what happened. In the store near home, work suited her more on the schedule and loyalty to the sudden urgent absences than in the company, to which was to drive another 5 stops. And then the second pregnancy happened. And when the youngest was born, she and her husband decided that with his good salary, it would be enough for the family, and she could continue working as a salesman. It would be convenient. The schedule 2 after 2 and everything else. It was very satisfying. And now it turns out that again the salesman is the best option, because, well, what kind of office career is she now? And it seems to me, you with your experience and erudite could find a better place than in a kiosk at the bus stop, said Alex. "Oh, behind the eyes, Natalie, don't. You have no idea, but here too, if they take it, it'll be a miracle." "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I'd just like to make a suggestion." "What?" Natalie was born in her purse, her ringtone playing. "It's just that I have a sales position open right now," Alex said. "The Queen's Diamond Jewelry Store." She'd heard of it. It was a very expensive and high-end place. She'd walked right past it the other day. "You're kidding." Natalie deflected the challenge. It was Tom, and he could definitely wait. And anyway, Natalie wasn't sure she was ready to talk to him right now. The man had come to visit her yesterday, as usual, but he'd been drunk. He'd made some stupid claims, and it got to the point where she pushed him out onto the landing, afraid of his anger. And even though he's probably sobered up by now, Natalie didn't want to talk to him. "Why not?" "Just kidding." Alex gave her an attentive look. "Where am I, and where is the jewelry boutique?" Natalie waved her hands. "I have no experience with jewelry or with your customers in general." "What about them?" "With customers?" Alex asked with a smile. "You know," shrugged Natalie, "there probably you need a special approach, knowing some etiquette and all that." "You are charming," Alex laughed. And Natalie bit her lip nervously. His laughter affected her strangely, sending clusters of goosebumps along her spine. Pleasant ones. Our clients are actually the most ordinary people. They just have money, and they're used to getting better from the product to the service itself. And yes, I can tell you exactly why I'm offering this to you. You, Natalie, not only have the proper education and experience, albeit in the marketplace and in simple places, but you have something equally valuable. He was silent for a while, obviously thinking about something, then continued. You have a literate, pleasant speech. You give the impression of an intelligent man. And I'm sorry, you are certainly not one of those women who in every client, no matter whether single or wearing a wedding ring, see a potential daddy. And pardon me for being blunt, you don't disgrace my establishment with your pathetic attempts at dating. Natalie was a little shocked because it was too good. It turns out she met the owner of the high-end jewelry salon himself. And after she herself, in fact, ran into his car, he did not scold her and drove away, but also gave her coffee, listened to her whining, and then offered her a ride, and now offered to go to work for him. "I'll think about it," finally Natalie said, "but I just want it right away." "You want to warn me that you can expect anything from a single mom with 2 kids, he grinned. "Believe me, I can imagine how hard it is. I mean, my sister got divorced recently, and she's got 2 twin daughters in daycare, and she doesn't have time for anything." Natalie didn't. A pertinent but not polite remark that it's wrong to compare the problems and opportunities of a single mom who is the most ordinary woman and the one who is the sister of a millionaire. She only nodded and said she could send him a resume in that case. Alex said that the interview was, in fact, already underway, and added that if she wanted, she could go to work even tomorrow. "Thank you," Natalie said. "Stop right there, please. There's one more place I have to go." "A market stall." Alex raised his eyebrows. "Yes, I have a job interview at the stall," with dignity said Natalie. "First of all, I got here before I got here with you. And secondly, it's just nice to have a choice, you know." "I do. And I find it worthy of respect," Alex answered seriously. "Wait," he called out when she got out of the car. "We haven't exchanged phone numbers, and then I can wait for you and take you home." "No, thank you. You've already done a lot." The woman smiled. "I still have to go to the store and pick up my sons from daycare." "Goodbye, Alex." She waved him off. "See you later," he replied, and he gave her a thoughtful look. What bizarre turns fate sometimes makes. Alex thought, how did it happen that he met this woman? And under such particular circumstances, it was so strange. But she seemed to him unique, extraordinary. As soon as he saw her frightened, confused near his car. And then, oh, why her? Why is this her story? Grim, bitter, cruel, and nightmarishly intertwined with his family's story. What's he supposed to do with all this? And the big question is how to tell her the truth or not. But then what would happen when she found out? Getting out quietly, Alex twisted the steering wheel and, having waited from the car at the maximum speed allowed, rushed through the city. He had a lot more to do for today. The rest of the day, which pleased and calmed, was life-expanding. Natalie's nerves had passed quietly and without any miscellaneous such and such surprises. She'd even been lucky enough to buy fish at a discount, so it was fried fish for dinner, not cutlets. She dialed Tom herself and told him they should probably take a break from talking. He began to whine that he wouldn't drink anymore, that it was all so random. And Natalie sighed and forgave him. From the kindergarten together with her sons, she took the news that the holiday on March 8 will be a matinee and all the children will prepare gifts for their mothers. The teachers decided that the best thing to do would be crafts made of paper, flowers, something made of plasticine, and we could also draw pictures. Natalie made a note in her notebook where she wrote down everything about the family budget to buy colored paper or watercolor paints. Both would be expensive, and it was quite evening before she remembered the jewelry that this strange old lady Margaret had passed on to her. Natalie twirled it around in her hands again. It was beautiful. And maybe, if not costume jewelry, even expensive, she decided. No, it must be returned, and what would do that? She dialed her mother-in-law's number for starters. "I'm not asking for money," hastily announced her intentions to Natalie so as not to be thrown from the other side of the phone. When asked if she knew anything about one of her son's teachers, the mother-in-law gave a predictable answer. No, because why would she even want to know? But then she sighed and said she remembered a certain Margaret. "Wait," said the mother-in-law, and leaving the phone on the line, went somewhere to the side. For half an hour, Natalie listened to the rustling. Then the mother-in-law said that apparently Chris sometimes wrote letters to this Margaret. She found her address in her son's old notebook and dictated it. "Thank you," Natalie said. She wouldn't call, wouldn't get in touch with her mother-in-law. But it so happened that after her husband's death, almost all of his belongings, toys, children's diaries, mother-in-law took for himself. And Natalie didn't mind. They were his parents after all. After reading the address, Natalie realized that Margaret didn't live very far away, so she could go to her tomorrow. Of course, it would be better to call first, but the phone was definitely impossible to get. The next day morning, Natalie found a message from Alex on her smartphone. "Received." Smiling, she wrote back, "No, so I can send a resume." A minute later, he replied, "And I've accepted. When to wait?" "Tomorrow, if possible. What time should I come over?" Natalie asked. And he answered that by 9 he will be at the salon and personally familiarize her with all the specifics of the work. They talked details and signed the papers. At the right address, where Natalie went immediately after taking the children to kindergarten, there was a typical panel 9-story building. The yard in front of it was planted with poplars which, judging by the thickness of the trunk, were at least 50 years old. There were flower beds under the windows of the first floors, and although it was too early for full blooming, in some places primroses were already sticking. And the whole picture suggested to Natasha that it could be incredibly beautiful here in summer. And on the bench at the entrance, where, according to the sign, the right apartment was located, sat the ubiquitous grandmothers. Natalie decided to address them. "Excuse me, could you tell me if Margaret lives here?" Margaret, that's interesting. One of the old ladies looked at her. She's been here about 100 years. Are you from Social Security? Another grandmother asked, and before Natalie could answer, she splashed her hands. It's about time, or they'll torture the poor woman to death. Torture who? Asked Natalie. Her daughter-in-law. A third old woman joined the conversation. Her adopted son ran away from them. I mean that he goes to work on a shift, earns money, and drinks it all there, so he doesn't come home. And he doesn't care about his mother. The grandmother who had answered Natasha first added her own note to the general story, and then from what these old ladies were saying, the whole approximate picture of Margaret's difficult life became clear to Natalie. She had a late and unsuccessful marriage in her life, in which she was womanly ill and unable to give birth herself. She adopted a boy from an orphanage. Her husband at first supported the idea, but then changed his mind and ran away. So Margaret raised her son alone. Then the son got married, and family relations finally went to pieces. Daughter-in-law did not put in anything mother-in-law and in general hated her presence. The situation, by the way, aggravated by the fact that Margaret began to have mental problems. She wasn't crazy, but sometimes she could go for a walk in the city and get lost. Sometimes she would start catching neighbors and passersby to talk to them about the distant past, to pour out her soul about the problems of her youth. All in all, it wasn't easy. What's your business? Finally, Natalie was asked. My husband was once a student of Margaret's. She decided to answer as honestly as possible, but without details. She and I met by chance in the cemetery at his grave. So I decided to visit her one day. They were good friends, I think, after he graduated from high school. Finally, Natalie stepped into the entryway, took the elevator to the 5th floor, and pressed the bell button with trepidation. If everything she'd been told about Margaret's sister-in-law Elizabeth was true, this meeting promised to be anything but pleasant. What do you want? A woman in a colored robe opened the door. Hello, excuse me please. Natalie sucked in a little more air. That was a problem, by the way. Elizabeth reeked of onions and what didn't seem like fresh fish. Natalie tried to spell out in a cursory manner that she needed to see Margaret because she was her deceased husband's teacher. Met her at the cemetery. And what? Elizabeth interrupted her. What do you want? Can I talk to her? Natalie gave her a friendly smile. It's private. Elizabeth glared at her. You're not a crook, are you? You don't want the old one to sign the apartment over to you or sell her miracle pills. What are you talking about? Natalie was indignant. All right, come on in. With a wave of her hand, Elizabeth stepped aside. The apartment smelled no better than it did on the landing, and even the air seemed to be humid. The bathroom reeked of tortured, not fresh laundry. Natalie was glad she'd skipped breakfast, just a cup of cocoa. She's out of her mind, Elizabeth said angrily. Always running away from home. What am I supposed to do? Chase her all over town? It's high time to put her in an orphanage, and I don't need her. She's nothing to me. Natalie did not say that she, Elizabeth, and Margaret were nobody, and that she should respect her mother-in-law according to the unwritten moral laws, if only because she lived on her property. Those from downstairs, from the bench by the entranceway, enlightened Natasha, and about the fact that Elizabeth, she came from the village to the city, and, in fact, had nothing. Until she married Margaret's son, and even now she didn't work. She lived on what her husband transferred from the north before he could drink it. She roars. She's been sitting up all night. Elizabeth complained. She's a hysterical old woman who sold her own trash, and now she's bawling. What trash? I don't know. Elizabeth poked me. I don't go in her room and she's a pigsty. She's all over her stuff. She thinks I want to steal it and come in. Maybe then she'll calm down and stop whining. Elizabeth waved her hand, pointing to the door, and went into the bathroom. From there came the sound of a glint, something being wiped off by hand. Natalie sighed and knocked. Margaret, she called out. I'm sorry, if I may. There was no answer. She waited a moment, then opened the door. She expected to see something even worse than she had already observed in this apartment, long in need of renovation. But to her surprise, the small room was relatively clean and even breathed easier. There was the usual empty old furniture, lace doily bedspreads, pudgy and prehistoric model TV. On another doily stood a radio, on the windowsill a few pots of flowers. On the walls, evoked from the Soviet-era posters about the teaching profession, And then there were books, as there were many of them here. Margaret sat on the neatly made bed and did not immediately pay attention to the guest. On the old woman's lap lay an open photo album. "Good afternoon," said Natalie cautiously and stood still. "Do you mind if I come in? It's just, you see, you left the cemetery so abruptly, and I thought we needed to." Natalie struggled to find the right words and generally felt stupid. "You're the one who finally got the old woman's attention. But come on in, now that you're here. Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you," Natalie replied. She belatedly realized that she had come empty-handed, not a cake or candy. However, the thought of drinking from dishes from the kitchen, which was clearly not Margaret's but Elizabeth's, made her nauseous. All in all, there was no time for tea. In the most delicate terms, Natalie tried to explain to Margaret that, of course, she was very grateful for the gesture, but she unfortunately did not understand why it was given to her. And secondly, she cannot simply accept such a gift. "Please take this as yours," she said, holding out the jewelry in the palm of her hand. The old woman looked at it as if she were ready to corn a poisonous spider. "This is yours now," she replied, just mysterious, and turned away, again focused on looking at the photo in the album. For a few minutes in the room hung silence, disturbed only by some retro song coming from the radio, singing the delights of conquering the taiga by young people. Natalie pondered whether to leave the jewelry on the dresser, but she thought it would be ugly and insulting. "Is that you?" she asked, nodding at one of the pictures. It showed a young woman with thick, dark hair pulled back into a boffin style. She was pictured in the park with a bouquet of gladiolus in her hands, looking at the camera and smiling mischievously. Margaret nodded, which could be taken as an affirmative answer. Then suddenly Natalie spoke. Listening to her slender, quiet story, I dared not interrupt it. So much of this past event from the life of one ordinary teacher, believing in love, goodness, and happiness, rose colorfully before her eyes. And it was shocking in terms of the content of which was revealed in full by the end of the all erased the mistake from her life. That child, which Margaret renounced, was not yet a year old. How she met the man with whom she decided to try again to create a family. But before it turned out that he was not ready, Margaret learned her terrible for a woman diagnosis of infertility, and she considered this disease as a punishment for giving up her firstborn. But life, as they say, went on, and something had to be done about it. That's when she decided to adopt. And then the rest of Margaret's story was already known to Natalie. "I sympathize." She squeezed the words out of her mouth. Natalie tried the situation on herself for a moment and was horrified. No, she couldn't do that. But Margaret was a different person. So how could she judge? I guess it's none of her business. Natalie was about to say she sympathized again, and then she was going to give the jewelry back. But Margaret spoke again. "I couldn't love him the way I couldn't love my own. He was fed, clothed, and clothed. I never laid a hand on him in my life, but there was no warmth of soul that should be between a mother and a child. Because I looked at my Jack and realized that he was growing up. And there was another person growing up somewhere, the one who was dear to me. So I started looking for him. No one wanted to tell me where he had been taken. No one cared how my motherly heart was hurting. But I still searched for him, and after 10 years I found out the whole truth. My own son was adopted by people from the same town where I lived. From that, yes, I found him." Margaret paused briefly. It was hard to swallow, and she coughed. Natalie handed her a drink of water, a glass and decanter standing nearby on the nightstand. It was evident that the conversation was tiring the older woman. But Natalie did not interrupt her. It was almost an instinctive realization that Margaret was very important and needed to talk about everything and pour out, as they say, her soul. Which apparently she hadn't been able to do for quite some time. Only I realized I couldn't ruin his life. I couldn't say, "I'm your real mom." But I guess fate took pity on me, because that boy Margaret looked at Natasha very carefully. He came to my school to study, so I was able to see him grow up. I could watch him almost every day. It went on like that for a very long time. And then I couldn't stand it. And I went to his parents. I realized I had to talk to them about it. I wanted them to understand me, and maybe they would allow me to visit them sometimes, to see my boy more often. But they said no. They were angry with me. So it's scary to remember. Margaret had a drink, and they told her not to go near him again, that they transferred me to another school. And they thought I should be given more money. But they didn't have much money in cash back then. She nodded at the jewelry. Still in Natalie's hand, they gave me this. They said it was silver and diamonds. That it was antique and worth a lot of money? What do I care about money? I've lost my son. Margaret spoke very softly now, almost in a whisper. I realized it was time I stopped seeing him, that it only hurt my soul. That's how I retreated. And then when he grew up, did you ever think of meeting him and explaining everything? Natalie asked. No, Margaret shook her head. How would that be? Think about it. He's thought he was family all his life. No, I only sometimes. After the summer camp incident, he wrote me letters to congratulate me on holidays. It was enough for me to read letters from him a couple times a year or talk to him on the phone. After the camp incident, Natalie asked her question glumly. Until now, she had taken Margaret's story a little lightly. But now her last words were rapidly coming together, and what Natalie knew of this teacher of her husband's. No, she exhaled. It can't be Chris. And it is him. Margaret sighed. Chris, my darling, he died, and I wasn't even there. I was there to seek him off. I must have been a bad mother. Natalie jumped up and paced the room. It just didn't make sense. Could it be that her Chris had spent his whole life in ignorance of his origins, and yet he had regular, even if formal, contact with his birth mother? Was it possible that his in-laws and even her to his wife had not revealed this secret about his origins? And now what? It turned out that this old woman that she is, in fact, her own mother-in-law. And she's also Matt and Nick's own grandmother. You're confused, Natalie repeated, and take it away. She added, holding out the jewelry. I don't need it, and I'm sorry, but you're wrong. It can't be. Why not? Margaret asked. And that simple question made Natasha freeze. Why indeed? Is the fact that a child was given up for adoption and adopted, and then no one told him the truth is such an incredible story? No, it's not. There's more to life than that, and Natalie understood that perfectly well, which made her feel even more confused. What was she to do with all this information? I took it, Margaret said, pointing her finger at the sparkling pendants so they would believe I wouldn't say anything to him, or they'd probably break up and move to another town, and I kept my word. And no matter how hard life got, I didn't sell that thing because I don't need it now. But Chris is gone. My little boy is gone. And you're his wife and my daughter-in-law, so take it. You're poor, I know. Sell it, and you'll be able to raise my grandchildren. And if you don't believe me? Margaret added grimly to me, then ask your mother-in-law, Chris's adoptive mother, and show it to her, and see what she'll tell you. Excuse me, said Natalie. I have to go. I'll be sure to think about everything. She walked, or rather jumped, out of the old lady's room and then out of the apartment. Stepping out of the entryway, she skipped in politely. No reaction whatsoever to the question about how Margaret's visit had gone. The question had been asked by one of the grandmothers on the bench. No, Natasha needed to get as far away from this place as possible. Period. Yes, the day hadn't gone quite as she planned. Precisely because she was absorbed in her own thoughts and worries. She didn't notice that her children were looking at each other puzzled, elbowing each other. And when their mothers turned away, they whispered. No, Natalie didn't care about any of that. She just made lunch, then dinner. Today, by the way, she picked up Nick and Matt from kindergarten much earlier in their group. One of the kids got the flu, due to which to attend kindergarten. Now it was not necessary about one quarantine for a week. And on this occasion, by the way, Natalie even experienced some relief. After all, now it was not necessary to clap supporters, because if the matinee was held, she would have to help her sons with the fakes. They were tasked with making a paper bouquet of tulips. However, not attending the kindergarten also created certain problems. After all, just tomorrow Natalie had to go to work, and the boys, of course, could not be left alone. But a solution was quickly found. May, a neighbor, agreed to look after the boys for a few hours a day, taking them to herself. May herself was also a mom, but her child in principle was not a daycare center. Not because he was sick, no. Archie was doing wonderfully well health-wise, but because of an unusually capricious degree of assiduity, a tendency to prank and disobedience. But he got on with Nick and Matt just fine, by the way. And even as May was surprised to recognize more than once in their society, Archie behaved much more well-mannered and positive in all senses. Entering the Queen's Diamond Jewelry Boutique, Natalie was a little confused. It seemed to her that now she would be told from the doorstep that it was all a ridiculous mistake, and instead of her they had already taken another 100 times more suitable applicant. But how had she been wrong? Alex met her at the doorstep and gave her a tour of the store. It turned out he knew a lot about jewelry. He was poring over the names of stones, talking about collections from leading jewelry houses. Natalie, by the way, looked at a couple of price tags and was simply shocked. No, of course, she understood that rich people bought such things, but to give so much money for some earrings with a couple of stones that would be enough to buy 2 large apartments in the center of the city. Natalie just couldn't imagine how much one had to earn to afford such a thing, and how one could spend money like that, when it seemed there were so many other important things in the world where they could be used, for example, to help orphans. Alex smoothly but resolutely introduced her to the specifics of the store, showed her the back rooms, bragged about the luxurious security system digital technology, and finally introduced her to the plump curly brunette with a stern expression on her face. Meet Viola, our, so to speak, permanent leader and director of this branch of the jewelry chain. Natalie said hello and was startled. Surely this strict aunt of about 50 years old would smear her now. But she was wrong again. Viola turned out to be a friendly and patient person. She said that for the first 2 weeks, Natalie would be paired with her. This is a common practice for their store, a kind of mentoring, after which she will become an independent salesperson, a consultant. And then Natalie tapped her finger on a stack of books, materials for self-education. So to speak, it is not necessary to learn by rote, but it is very desirable to familiarize yourself with them. Do you understand? Our customers want the seller can not only pull the goods from the showcase, but also able to present it beautifully. This means that it is important to be able to talk about the origin of stones features, for example, types of clasps on the necklace. Anyway, you'll figure it out. I'll try my best. Natalie swallowed nervously. Yeah, she thought, I'm a fool. She laughed at her sons when they said they were afraid to go to first grade because there would be so much science. Well, maybe she's scared about the same thing now. The first day of work went well. Natalie stood in front of Viola and watched her interact with the customers. A bald man in a white suit came in and picked out some ruby cufflinks. Here came a lady with a tiny syringe, which sat right in her bag, looking out of their funny face. The lady went through bracelets for a long time, complaining that she needed turquoise strictly from Afghanistan, because it was better there. And finally, when Viola showed her what she wanted, she bought everything and left. There were other people. Natalie knew it was not good to count other people's money, but she was amazed how easy it was for people to make such large purchases. And then 2 people entered the store. A young couple. Here we go. Kat stretched out. Another saleswoman who had been looking at Natasha with a contemptuous sneer and envy from the start. It's the 3rd time the beggars have come in. All they do is look and buy nothing. Natalie looked closely at the couple. The girl was late in her pregnancy and dressed like her companion. Very simply cheap, but clean and neat. There's your test. Viola smiled suddenly at her student and gave her a gentle nudge in their direction. Go on. Good afternoon. May I ask if I can be of any help to you? Natalie took a deep breath and spoke the way Viola had taught her. Hello. The girl smiled shyly in return. Would we like to see something with pearls? Yes, of course. Natalie began to sing about what a gorgeous collection of pearls they had, including black and a very rare gold one. But then she realized that these people wouldn't buy them. And the girl saw the price tags on the things Natalie was praising. But you know, I would advise you to pay attention to the products with river pearls. Suddenly decided to change the line of trying to make a sale Natalie, despite the fact that he is of farm origin. In terms of characteristics, it is not inferior to wild pearls. It was the kind of pearls that back in the 16th century were on par with fur and highly valued in Venice. And Natalie told some interesting facts. She showed closer earrings, beads, rings, and other items. Then the girl sighed. Probably this ring right here. And earrings, said the guy. His companion dropped her gaze. She was surprised at his generosity. Yes, he said, it's okay, Amy. We can afford it. Don't worry, David's still calling me over. I've got some more movers coming in. Kat's at the other end of the hall and poked her palm. Those poor customers were so hilarious. And when they left, Kat was the one who started discussing them with her co-workers. Gossiping girls asked Viola sternly as she approached them. Then she turned to Natasha. I can praise you, because Alex says that we always appreciate every customer, literally every customer, and for everyone we must be able to find the right products. Even if it took all day. Kat and her celestial friends opened their mouths because the praise from Viola was no easier to wait for than a snowfall in the middle of July. In the afternoon, Alex stopped by the boutique again and offered to pick up Natalie for a ride home. She could have taken public transportation, of course, but unexpectedly she agreed. For what, by the way, she received another look full of dislike from Kat, who was, like some other saleswomen in this jewelry chain, a little unrequitedly in love with Alex. True, this crush was mostly based not on his human qualities, but on the fact that he was very rich and not bad-looking. But how was the first day of work? Alex asked Natalie, and it was not a formality. He was really interested. She told him everything in detail. "What is it?" she asked, perplexed, when Alex, when they had already arrived at her house, suddenly took out a wad of bills from his wallet. An advance, he answered simply, and a bonus, he added, noticing how suspiciously Natalie looked at the money, because it was a lot for an advance. "I have an original approach," Alex said. "Looking with the most honest eyes, I always give a bonus to employees at the beginning of work to motivate them." "Thank you," said Natalie, and took the money. It was so unexpected, but it was also very convenient. Now she could pay off almost all of her rent and buy groceries, and perhaps a new jacket for Matt. The sleeves were already up to her elbows. The first full shift was scheduled for tomorrow. Natalie said goodbye to Alex and even waved goodbye to him as she walked toward her driveway. Who was that? A hoarse, familiar voice sounded behind her. Natalie turned around, almost jumping up, and saw Tom. "Hi," she said. "Yeah, it's work." "Work?" Tom grinned and came closer. "Why aren't the buses running?" "Tom." Natalie shrugged. She didn't like the feel of his hand on hers. "But don't be silly. It's just interesting. So you don't have time to meet, but you have time to ride around with men." "He's not a man, he's my employer." Natalie only now suddenly realized vividly what disgusting manners Nikolai had in terms of personal hygiene. "Tom, I'm tired. Let's talk later." "Okay. When later?" He craned his neck. Then evasively replied Natalie, "I'm busy. I have a new job." "Where?" "At the jewelry store." "Ah," stretched out Tom. He hummed again. "That's clear, but see you later." "I'll come by later," he added with a nudge, looking over his shoulder. "I mean, we're serious. I mean, we're practically family. Your boys will be calling me baby soon." No way in hell, Natalie thought. I don't want a father like you for my sons. But she didn't say it out loud. She went home. Her mood was a little ruined, and that inner nervous tension that makes you dizzy and tight in your chest had returned. Because Natalie realized that perhaps it was time to end this relationship with Nicholas, because he may not be a bad man in general, but she definitely and absolutely does not see him as a man with whom she would like to create a family. And what kind of man should he be? "Don't worry," May asked gently. They probably decided to walk to the store for some caramels, or to the neighbor's yard. "I'm looking for them now. I just thought I'd tell you to maybe come back and look for them too." Natalie didn't remember how she'd gotten back. She was in shock, horror, panic. Her mind was painting 1,000 pictures of what had happened to her babies, and it was one worse than the other. "No, we certainly don't have anything for that kind of money," the woman replied sternly and harshly, even rudely. "A saleswoman in a flower shop." "Where the boys, a big secret from everyone in the world, escaped to buy a bouquet of flowers for their mother on the eve of March 8. "Not at all." Nick stretched out pitifully, and his lips trembled. "Oh, come on, Lois," pushed the saleswoman in the side of her colleague. "Look how cute they are. They've saved up and want to please their mother. You don't want to bother with them." I rolled my eyes and poked Jim. "Guys, let me show you something." Amy leaned over and looked into the eyes of both brothers. They were marvelously charming, direct, good-natured boys. Amy herself was about to have her firstborn. According to the ultrasound, it was a boy. She was amazed by these boys who showed up at the flower stall to buy flowers. True, the money they had on them was just enough for nothing. 3 carnations from the vase of merchandise at most. Amy sighed and wondered if they should add some money from their personal funds. Then they could perhaps buy a few roses. "Look how pretty it is," Nick enthusiastically told Matt, and showed his hand a floral arrangement of sky blue and snow white flowers placed in a box, tied with a pink ribbon. "Auntie, how much is this?" Matt asked. Jen rolled her eyes. "As much as you can." "Boys, where's your mom?" Amy asked. "Why are you guys here alone?" "Why are you here alone?" Jim added sternly. "What about us?" Matt was suddenly afraid that they would be captured. "So how are there no adults around?" generally sent to the orphanage. Mom in the store began to lie he on the move, and we just so dropped by. Nick, let's go. He pulled his little brother by the sleeve, and together they ran out into the street, and they ran sideways. Whew! Matt ran his hand over his forehead. We're in trouble. What are we going to do now? Nick asked pitifully. Matt, Nick, are you doing something? A familiar voice suddenly sounded. Alex had visited Natalie's house once in the past weeks and had met her sons. And now, driving down the street, he suddenly noticed the boys, but Natalie was not with them for some reason. The brothers looked at him when he got out of the car. What about us? And Mom was at the store, Nick said, and immediately blushed to his ears. He couldn't lie at all. We're on our way home now, Matt put in a word. It's all right. You're not very good liars. You know that, don't you? Alex smiled and stood up, blocking the way. What's up with you guys? The brothers looked at each other again. Suddenly they started talking in chorus about how bad it is, that Mom is sad, that Dad used to give her flowers on March 8, and they wanted to give them. But not enough money. The kids also blabbed that they ran away from the neighbor, who was entrusted to look after them. It's all clear with you. Alex shook his head. Yes, it's May. She's probably going crazy in there. Maybe your mom's already been disturbed. Okay, no tears. Okay. Hurriedly, he turned to them and especially to Nick, who was already squinting, began. Let me take you home. But first, give us that bouquet over there, said Nick, when together with his brother and Alex entered the kiosk. What a day, Lois rolled her eyes. There's catching stray dogs. What about these kids? She muttered under her breath and then said louder. I already told you, for your pennies here cannot buy anything. Give us, please, this bouquet, said Alex, pulling out his wallet. Jen looked at him skeptically at first, but immediately softened. She knew how to recognize wealthy clients, and so she immediately scattered in all sorts of nice words, took out a bouquet and handed it to the client. Are these your children? She decided to keep the conversation going. Alex had no time to answer. It was done for him by Nick, who, like his brother, was very afraid that something bad was waiting for them for walking alone without their mom. It's our dad, he said, and grabbed Alex's hand tighter. Finally, they walked out of the flower shop. Matt said he wanted to carry the flowers himself, so Alex gave them to him. Then he put the brothers in the car and headed toward Natalie's house. On the way, he thought about the strange feeling that had arisen in his heart when the boy had called him father. It was something exciting, a little frightening, but mostly a pinching, beautiful feeling. Alex was definitely lucky for chance encounters today, because as he pulled up in front of Natalie's house, he saw her. She was running through the yard, shouting her sons' names loudly. Mom! Yelled Matt and skipped toward her. Nick ran with him. Alex also went in the same direction, not forgetting to grab the bouquet. My darlings. Natalie caught her sons in her arms and now crying from the experience of anxiety and joy showered with tender words. Alex told her what had happened. Why? Natalie grabbed Matt, the main instigator of what had happened. Shook him up a little. I almost lost my mind. Don't ever do that again. Natalie, it ended well. Well, no, Alex interceded for the little adventurer. Look at the beautiful bouquet they chose for you. Bouquet and Ein, she first paid attention to the flowers, aghast. So beautiful was the composition of the gifts of Flora. Natalie opened her mouth. She wanted to ask where the money had come from, but she guessed right away. You shouldn't have, she said. Shy, wasn't it? Actually, I was going to wish you a happy March 8th anyway. Alex shrugged. So you can consider it a bouquet from all three of us. You wanted to say that on the occasion of the holiday, why don't they all go to a cafe? And Natalie realized at that moment that she really liked Alex in a romantic way. And Nick and Matt realized that they also liked him as a family friend, that he was 1,000 times better than Uncle Tom. And they didn't mind him visiting them. But then a new face appeared near them. Alex. He was called out by a young woman in an elegant pantsuit. Shock magazine. I made an appointment for you, but you ignored me. Alex's face changed. Through Natalie a curt, I'm sorry, I'll be right back, and grabbed the press representative under the elbow, literally dragging her aside. This wasn't just any reporter. Alex had once had an affair with her and they'd parted ugly. And since then, this person seemed determined to spread all the ridiculous rumors about him that she could gather or even make up. Alex had already threatened more than once that he would get the lowbrow magazine closed down. And now I wish I'd taken care of it. We have nothing to talk about, he said, dryly. I've already explained to you that we're done, and stop getting personal. Aha, that's what you mean. The journalist threw off her chin and flashed her eyes dangerously. You have an icy heart. We just didn't see eye to eye, and it wouldn't have worked out. For what must be the 1,000th time, Alex repeated. I hate you, whispered the journalist. It's mutual, he grinned back. So you're with her now? It's none of your business. Yes, it is. I forgot. We broke up. The reporter snorted. Oh, she knows. Ah, her eyes were shining now, like a hungry tiger that had smelled its prey. She doesn't know. Yes. It's none of your business. And it's none of your business, Alex said. But it was too late. Hey, journalist, Natalie waved her hands. Do you know that Alex is Sam's cousin who killed your husband? It seemed to Natalie that heaven and earth had changed places, that the surrounding reality had run out of air, and that she was falling into the abyss. No, it couldn't be true, but something told her it wasn't a lie. She looked at Alex shocked, disbelieving. What are you like? He said to his ex-girlfriend and paid no further attention to her. Walked over to Natalie. Look, I can explain everything. You don't have to. Natalie put her hands out in front of her. Don't, stay away, please. She squeezed her eyes shut. Spots of fire danced beneath the branches. How lucky were the boys, the sons, not to hear that. 5 minutes earlier, May had shown up and taken them home. That is, to her house for now, promising to feed them soup along with her Archie. Alex obeyed and stopped. He saw the hurt, disappointment, and something much deeper and darker than the usual resentment splashed in Natalie's eyes. He saw in those eyes that he didn't stand a chance. Should I leave? Quietly, he asked. She didn't answer, just nodded. And then she turned away and walked toward the entrance. And how Alex wanted to rush after her, to turn her to him. To make her look him in the eye and explain everything, to make her believe the truth that changed everything, that explained everything. But he realized that trying to do such a thing would make things worse. Perhaps she needed time. Or did everything now appear to be destroyed forever? He didn't know that, but all he knew was that right now he had to leave. It was weird to the point of being creepy. But the rest of the day was normal for Natalie, in the sense that she didn't give anything away to her sons. They dismantled the bouquet together and moved it to the biggest vase they could find. And then they watched cartoons together, and just after putting their little ones to bed, Natalie let herself cry. She couldn't figure out how he could lie to her and how it had even happened and what was it. He knew she couldn't help but know, didn't he? I mean, she had told him everything about herself back then. So what had he done? Why him? The next morning, Natalie didn't go to the Queen's Diamond Boutique because she absolutely did not want a job from a man who was from that very same family. Anyway, Natalie couldn't even think about Alex now. She wasn't surprised when she woke up the next morning with a headache and a sickening feeling as if the blows of fate weren't over for her and something bad was about to happen. After all, decided Natalie good in life, surely there must be some black streaks to go along with it, right? And who could guarantee that the next black streak for her little family wouldn't drag on for 100 years? The call from an unknown number rang when Natalie sat down to mend the denim jacket Matt had torn during the yard games, and she was on pins and needles. Because on top of everything else, Nick had spiked a fever during the night. Nick was always sick like that. First, he'd get sick, feverish and sick, and then literally in less than 24 hours, he was on the mend in no time. So he was reacting to colds. And yesterday, while on his crazy adventures with his brother, he'd been running around town. Natalie was sure her son had a cold. Probably some kind of spam, Natalie thought, but something compelled her to answer. Yes, she asked absent-mindedly, who's calling and what's it about? She didn't understand, because the voice on the other end, which belonged to an older woman, sounded very anxious and its owner was confused. But at last they explained themselves. It turned out to be a call from one of the vigilant neighbors of the pensioners, with whom Natalie had already made a brief acquaintance when she visited Margaret. And it turned out that Elizabeth had carried out her threat and gotten rid of Margaret. The caller introduced herself as Joan and explained that Margaret herself had given her Natalie's number not long ago. Did the poor girl sense that something bad might happen to her and begged her to send word to the only person who could possibly care about her? Natalie was shocked by what she heard. But what can I do to help? she asked. What had happened in the first place? Terrible. Joan blurted out a secret story. It turned out that Margaret had had a heart attack not long ago and had been called to an ambulance, and Elizabeth, after a while, taking advantage of Margaret's weak, sickly condition, forced her by trickery, blackmail, and deceit to give her part of the apartment that belonged to Margaret. She promised that everything would be fine and that this would only make it easier for her to receive her inheritance in the future. And then Elizabeth decided that since she was the boss of the place, she could get rid of the old woman altogether. She lied to Margaret that she was taking her to a sanatorium and drove her to an empty cottage community and left her there, saying that it would be better for Margaret to live there now, rather than get in the way in the apartment. Oh, sighed Natalie. What's to be done now then? Obviously you have to take her away, Joan blurted out. Anyway, Margaret said you're her friend. And then Faith dictated which cottage community Margaret had been taken to, where and how to find her there. Thanking her for the news, Natalie ended the call. Really, what was there to do? No, she didn't doubt in the slightest that Margaret had to be bailed out, nor did she shrug off the reality of the whole affair. After all, it was well known how helpless and naive old people could be. But she just couldn't imagine how to deal with it, and here I feel like the most intrusive, most insufferable person in the world. Natalie went to her neighbor again to ask her to watch the boys some more, plus give Nick his antipyretics and other needed medications on time as scheduled. A quarter of an hour later, Natalie was already out of the driveway and racing to the bus stop. Natalie, a familiar voice called out to her. She turned around, rolled her eyes. Tom was the only thing missing right now. We need to talk, he said, slouching, walking toward her, his gait unsteady, his face swollen. Clearly, he'd been drinking. How long are you going to run away from me? He asked. Angry, what are you doing? We're family. Tom sighed to Natalie. I don't have time and we're not family. Ah stretched it and crooked grin. How did you need that before, Tom? To feed your puppies. And now you're tangling with a millionaire. You think he wants your puppies. And he doesn't care about you at all. He shut his mouth and apologized, and then he left. Just as Alex appeared so unexpectedly close by, did he materialize out of thin air? But no, Natalie realized. He just walked up, and she'd been so preoccupied with worry that she hadn't noticed his car was nearby. Yeah, you went Tom to Alex, but he took him by the scruff of the neck. The men locked eyes. Get out of here. For the last time. Alex said, believe me, you don't want to mess with me. Back off, you psycho. Tom recoiled, deliberately squeamish from the other man's touch. He gave Natalie a contemptuous look and spat under his feet. Oh, come on, you crazy chicken. It's human to purr. Tom drunkenly staggered off into the backyards. I know you can tell me, Alex said, that you don't want to see me and know that I'm a monster and a liar. But I'm begging you, just let me tell Natalie. And Alex spoke up. He admitted that yes, he knew who she was from the beginning because he did belong to that family. However, that was exactly what kinship was. And in fact, Alex had hardly interacted with those people and had never lived with them together ever. But he knew about that history. And when he met Natalie and found out who she was, he just couldn't admit it. Why not? Because he realized that she would have been prejudiced against him, to say the least. And it was important to him very much, because from the very beginning, he began to feel sympathy for her. He was afraid that she would start treating him based on the fact that one of his relatives had done it. And that's basically stupid, because Alex hadn't spoken to his cousin in years, and they were completely different people in general. But then I realized that one day you're going to find out anyway. Sad, he finished. I know I should have told you myself, but I kept procrastinating. I thought I'd let a little more time pass, and then he spread his hands. How did it end? It was very strange to Natalie. She never imagined that a conversation could make such a difference. But right now, she no longer felt the resentments of anger and almost hatred that burned her from the inside out. Just yesterday, she had suddenly realized that Alex, yes, he was a completely different person. He didn't owe it to the mere power of his ancestry to be like his cousin. And yes, Natalie believed his every word. And it wasn't even just faith, but some deep, almost instinctual conviction that he wasn't deceiving her. That he was exactly the kind of man he had seemed to her in all the past days of their acquaintance. But all of that Natalie didn't say now. She only nodded and they met gazes. and though it didn't seem like it was enough. But right now it was more than enough for Alex. And then Natalie said that she couldn't stay any longer, unfortunately, because she had something urgent to do. What was it? Alex asked. And she answered him. I'll drive you, he said. And Natalie got into his car. And as they drove to the cottage community, she told him everything. Margaret? Alex explained. But I know her. She used to teach at school, at a private grammar school, where I studied for a short time. Then she was said to have gone away. I think she and her husband were trying to settle in another city. I remember her. She was. He smiled sadly, a wonderful teacher. She gave all of herself to her students. Everything turned out to be exactly as Natalie had fearfully assumed. The dacha community was now in some disrepair. It was a little early for gardening, after all. Margaret found herself in a cottage so dilapidated that it looked as if it might collapse in a gust of wind. The poor old woman was freezing. Her sister-in-law hadn't even bothered to give her warm clothes, and she didn't seem to be thinking straight. But then she suddenly called Natalie by name and literally clung to her, as if she could otherwise be lost in the big world around her. Alex said that Nana needed to be seen by the doctors. She was obviously suffering from hypothermia, and she was psychologically traumatized from the eviction. Alex took Margaret to one of the best private clinics in the city, where she was accepted as the most expensive client thanks to his money. And then Alex said in his usual decisive manner that he would arrange everything, rent an apartment for Margaret, hire a good caregiver, and also, if she wanted, help her to deal with the fact that she would put in place a snooty daughter-in-law. But Margaret didn't want to. She forgave Elizabeth and she forgave her son too. She could no longer trust them to be her own people. I am alone with everything in the world, quietly cried the old woman. She was sitting in a single room. No, said Natalie, and approaching her bedside, gently took her hand. You are not alone, you have me. The words came hard to her, but she knew she was doing the right thing. Your daughter-in-law and your grandchildren. Truth. Margaret's hopeful eyes dropped. Yes, Natalie smiled at her. And if you want to, you can move in with us after the hospital. You did the right thing, Alex said. When he and Natasha left the room, Margaret was resting, finally catching up on her sleep. I hope so, sighed Natalie. Did I really have a choice? You always do. You could have just agreed to let me take care of her, provide for her at her age. But you realize that wouldn't have been enough for her. What she really needs is something else. Natalie said thoughtfully. Yes, Alex nodded. What do you need? The question took her by surprise, but when she met his gaze, Natalie suddenly realized that it seemed that the answer to that question was almost already written in the depths of her heart. She just needed to find the courage to read it and accept it. I'm not rushing, you said, as if Alex read her thoughts, but I want to know if I have a chance. Natalie was slow to answer, but Alex was very patient indeed, and eventually, and not even too late, he waited. 6 months later, he and Natalie were married. Her sons received him enthusiastically. Of course, they too had to discover the truth, but they, since explained everything to them, calmly accepted these facts. Normal. After the wedding, Natalie and the children moved in with Alex. He had a spacious 2-story cottage in the suburbs, and that's where Margaret moved in. And it turned out, by the way, that in normal conditions, when she does not stand over the soul-angry Elizabeth, all is absolutely fine with her head. And she even took to helping Misha and Nick with their schoolwork. And also Margaret, though forgiven, but now did not communicate with her adopted son and his wife at all. Despite the fact that Natalie had the option of not working at all, she told Alex honestly that it would be boring for her to live like that. And so he slowly began to introduce her to the affairs of his company, which owned jewelry showrooms. The adoptive parents of Natalie's dead husband were very unhappy that she had learned their secret and were even more unhappy that Natalie might tell her grandchildren. But Natalie decided that Matt and Nick, they needed to know that they had a loving, kind, native grandmother. And another year later, Alex and Natalie had a child together, a girl. And although Alex really wanted to name her something in honor of a gemstone, such as ruby or amber, Natalie finally persuaded him to choose a more appropriate name, and the girl was named Grace. And with the birth of the baby girl, the little family felt completely and utterly happy.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.